Mankind, the Universe, and the Infinity of God. Second version by Malcolm Bowden. There is no doubt that the human race has greatly benefited from the millions of scientific experiments that have taken place over hundreds of years. The evidence is all around us. However, in surveying the whole range of the research that is ongoing, there are two areas that seem to have the beginnings of some degree of limiting just how far man can penetrate the workings of this universe in which he finds himself. I am referring to the two limits of human investigations: the huge expanse of the universe and the strange workings of atomic-sized particles. 1. The universe. In mankind's contemplation of the starry heavens, he has always been overwhelmed by the sheer immensity of the panorama that he can survey every clear night. Literature abounds with the awe-inspiring vastness of space that comes upon all men, irrespective of their faith, or even lack of it. In the Bible we read, "The heavens declare the glory of God," in Psalm 19, verse 1. With all this sense of the vastness of space, there is the ever-present question: does space go on forever, for infinity, or is there a limit to it that God can be outside of it and can see it as a whole? This is a question that no man can answer, for the simple reason is that it would be necessary for man to be outside the universe to answer it, and man cannot do that during his earthly life. It will therefore remain an insoluble mystery to mankind. There are still mysteries within the universe that man has not solved, but generally these may be solvable with powerful telescopes or special equipment. However, some may still evade solution, such as the true nature of gravity and similar factors. In my True Science Agrees with the Bible, in Appendix 9, I give 11 examples of experiments that have been deliberately ignored by orthodox scientists simply because they do not fit into the rigid boundaries that are imposed by mainstream science. 2. The atomic particles. There is a simple experiment known as the two-slit experiment that has provided some baffling results. If a bright light of many photons are shone on the slits, then the pattern on the screen is of several bands of light and dark, as you would expect with two waves that have crests and troughs cancelling and adding on the screen. However, a single photon of light can be fired at two slits. This single photon seems to go through both slits and recombine on the screen behind at one single point position. As more single photons are fired, more dots appear on the screen, and they gradually build up into the same light and dark bands that you get with many photons. Thus, light seems to operate as both a particle and a wave, yet these forms are completely distinct in their mode and activity. How can light be in two different forms at the same time? In addition, if the scientist tried to detect which of the slits the photon went through, they all act like particles, and no interference pattern builds up. There is another experiment in which two photons are entangled, so they behave as one unit. They are then sent in opposite directions, and if on its travels one changes to a higher energy level, the other instantaneously changes into a lower energy level, even though it is many miles away from the other. How does it communicate to the other so rapidly, despite them being several miles apart? These are just a few of the strange results that scientists are discovering. The accusation might be made that we are seeking refuge in the God of the gaps, i.e., If we do not know how it works, then it must be God's doing. But later results do explain it, and we are pressed further back into an even smaller gap. It seems to me that these strange results are of a different order to the majority of experimental results. In his search for knowledge, man makes experiments in order to discover how a particular phenomena operates. He usually obtains a result that increases his knowledge of the workings of nature, and from this he can often use that knowledge for the improvement of mankind's well-being. The results further his knowledge of nature. These results seem to be different, for it is the results themselves that seem to be baffling and difficult to interpret. Mankind seems to be reaching the limits of his understanding of this universe at these two extremes of his investigations. Indeed, I cannot help feeling that we may be beginning to touch the hem of God's garment of infinity, and further research may uncover even more baffling results. I am reminded of the confident way in which molecular biologists expected to reveal the full workings of a simple bacteria. What they then found were increasing layers of complexity. Similarly, with the investigations of the kinesin motors that transport chemicals by walking along the microtubules in every cell. They have yet to determine how these bundles of amino acids work, how they know where to pick up the chemical, which microtubule they should use, and how they know where to deposit their chemical load. It is possible that we may be reaching the extreme limits of God's creation, the infinite and the zero. The mathematical parallel. I find a parallel case in mathematics regarding the dangers of careless handling of infinity and zero. If I use these two extremes, then I have no difficulty in proving that 3 equals 4, or any one number equals any other number I care to choose. Here we see the very simple algebraic process by which this can be carried out. By dividing by 0 and equating the two terms, we can show that 3 equals 4. Now notice what we have done. We have used normal algebra in strict accordance with accepted rules. But despite this, we have a result that is nonsense. Why should this be? The reason is that we have handled these two values as though they were normal figures, but their nature demands that we treat them with great caution. They must not be treated as though they were a normal part of arithmetic. In just the same way that we must be careful how we treat infinity and zero in maths and science, I would contend that we must also treat the infinity of God with very great care in our doctrine. Most people, and many Christians, faced with the proposition that God created this universe in 7 days, simply do not believe it. Similarly, they would reject the idea that Christ performed many miracles whilst on earth. What they are doing is bringing God down to a level that they can then comprehend. They fail to grasp the important point that God, and the way that He works, is infinite and well beyond their understanding. In other words, their God is too small. They cannot grasp the fact that God has infinite power and could have made this universe in a split second of time had He so wished. Christians also need to be reminded of the infinity of the Godhead in their doctrine. When man rebelled against God, he offended an infinite God, and therefore the punishment also had to be infinite. Man had nothing to offer, for he was already dead in his sin. It took the infinite second person of the Trinity to be willing to make that terrible sacrifice and pay the price that our rebellion should have cost us. Could I therefore warn the viewer about his approach to this infinite God? Too often I hear choruses in which the emphasis is, "Bless me with your presence," and similar thinking, with the underlying thought that, "Then I will be happy, but I want you to do all the hard work." As though God is under our command. I consider that this is one of the main reasons for the lack of awe of God in our worship services. There are two prime examples of God's response to man's questioning of God's reasons in the Bible, one Old Testament and one New Testament. The Old Testament rebuke in Job. Job, having suffered so much despite being a righteous man, protests his innocence, and eventually turns to God and asks, "Let the Almighty answer me," in chapter 31, verse 35. Then God thunders from heaven, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" chapter 38, verse 4. God makes it very clear that He is the ruler of the earth and will not answer every question that man cares to ask. The New Testament rebuke. Paul has stated that God has made a sovereign choice of who He will bless and who He will not bless in Romans chapter 9, verses 10 to 18. Knowing this seems unjust, he then says, "One of you will say to me, 'Then why does God still blame us?' He replies, 'But who are you, O man, to talk back to God?'" In other words, this is God's world, and He is running it His way, and not in the way that man can fully understand. There are limits to man's understanding of the universe. God has a perfect plan for the future, and everything is running exactly according to that plan. There is the passage in Deuteronomy 29:29 that states, "The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we may follow all the words of this law." The Westminster Shorter Catechism says that God is Spirit, who is infinite, eternal, and unchanging in His being, wisdom, power, holiness, justice, goodness, and truth. And I always add beauty and humility as worthy of special mention. No other definition can exceed this for its uplifting nobility. Therefore, could I suggest that the viewer should be very, very careful about his approach to this amazing, wonderful, and infinite God, whether in his scientific work, his doctrine, or his worship. He must be approached with that unusual combination of trust, love, and joy, but also with fear and trembling and great awe. It is this lack of awe which seems to be increasingly missing in the lives of many Christians today, to their great loss.